Welcome back to the deep dive. Remember that research you were telling me about with that document, the one in another language?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we finally got a translation. And let me tell you, this deep dive is going to be a little, well, intense.
It's quite the document, a step-by-step guide for rescuing people from, like, a massive flood.
Really?
Yeah, and it seems to be aimed at, like, ordinary people, almost like a community preparedness kind of thing.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking like a real-life disaster manual.
Exactly.
And that's what we're diving into today. Could this actually work? And what does it say about preparing for a disaster? Like, what can we learn from this?
Well, what's so compelling is how specific it is. This isn't just, some theoretical thing. It actually mentions 100 people stranded by floodwaters.
100 people.
Yeah, in Bihar, India.
Bihar, India. For our listeners, can you give us a little context? Like, why would a guide like this even exist there?
Sure. Bihar is a region in India that's unfortunately really prone to flooding, especially during monsoon season. So this kind of scenario, it's sadly not uncommon there.
So this guide is addressing a real and present danger then?
Oh, absolutely. And it jumps right into action.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What's the first thing it tells people to do?
Well, the first steps are pretty standard. Assess the situation and call for help if you can.
Right.
But then it gets really interesting. It really emphasizes organizing a group and assigning roles.
Wow, really? So they're telling people to take charge, almost like something you'd see in a disaster movie.
Yeah, exactly. And it highlights this crucial part of disaster response that I think often gets overlooked, which is community organization. When you have a large-scale disaster, often formal rescue efforts, they can be delayed, sometimes for quite a while.
Yeah.
So it's often neighbors helping neighbors that really makes the difference in those initial hours.
That's so true. It's easy to just assume that, help will just show up, but those first few hours, they're so critical.
Exactly. And this guide really wants to empower people to take action instead of just passively waiting for rescue.
Yeah.
And that's self-reliance, honestly. It can be life-saving.
Okay, so what comes next? Does it tell people to start, gathering supplies?
Yeah, that's the next step. It says to gather whatever tools and resources you can find, whatever's available.
Like what? I'm imagining people trying to build rafts out of debris or something.
Well, that's creative thinking, but this guide is a little more practical, actually. They actually recommend things like life jackets, ropes, and even, if possible, boats.
Boats during a flood. I mean, I get the concept of using what you have, but are there just boats lying around everywhere?
Well, remember, we're talking about a more rural area here. In Bihar, boats are actually not uncommon. They're emphasizing using resources that are already part of the community. What's already there.
That's a good point. This is really making me think about how unprepared I am for a disaster. If a flood hit my neighborhood, I'd be in trouble. But it sounds like this guide is about more than just the actual rescue part.
You're right. It goes beyond that. It also talks about first aid, finding shelter, and even addresses the mental impact of a disaster, which I think is really interesting.
Now, that's something I hadn't even considered. It's easy to focus on the immediate danger, but the emotional impact of something like a flood, that's huge.
It's a huge factor, definitely. Surviving something like this, it's not just about coming out of it physically okay.
Yeah.
This guide, it recognizes that. It even talks about things like counseling and support within the community after it's all over.
Wow. To think about that, the long-term effects, that's pretty incredible.
Right. It makes you realize these communities, they're dealing with this kind of threat, well, probably a lot more than we realize.
Yeah, it makes you think.
It's a different way of life.
Yeah.
Disaster preparedness, it's not just a suggestion, it's woven into how they live.
It really comes through in this guide, doesn't it? They've been through this, learned from it, and now they're sharing that knowledge. It's kind of humbling.
It is. It makes you stop and think, right? What would I do?
Yeah.
What would I turn to?
Exactly. It's so easy to just assume, I'll call 911. But what if you can't? What if the lines are down, the road's blocked? This guide, it makes you think about that, being totally cut off.
And that's what's so interesting, I think. It forces you to confront that fear, but then it also empowers you, right? Makes you think, okay, what can I do to be more prepared? Not just for myself, but my family, my neighbors, the whole community.
It's like this guy, it's almost like more than just instructions, it's like a reflection of their experience as a community.
Exactly. All that knowledge passed down. Think about it. Generations of living with these challenges, overcoming them. That's powerful stuff.
It's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom of prepping for disasters. But this guide, it almost feels, I don't know, kind of inspiring.
I know what you mean. It's a good reminder, right?
No.
Even when things are really bad, there's always hope. And there's always something we can do, to prepare ourselves and be there for each other.
That's a great point. Being prepared, being informed, but most importantly, being there for each other, when it really counts. I think we can all agree on that. So, listener name, thinking about all this guide, what really struck you about how they deal with disasters?
It's really something, how proactive they are. They don't just wait around, they anticipate it, prepare for it. And that whole community aspect, that's huge.
That's a powerful message, isn't it? We might not all be, living in flood zones or anything, but disasters, they can happen anywhere, right? Anytime.
Absolutely. Hurricane, earthquake, wildfire, you name it. The specifics don't really matter. It's those underlying things.
Yeah.
Being informed, prepared, knowing what your community has to work with, that's what matters.
This guide really makes you think, about those first few hours, even days after something happens. Help isn't always just going to appear.
Exactly. And that's where that self-reliance, the community aspect, it becomes so important. They're not just waiting for someone to bail them out. They're taking care of each other.
One thing that stuck with me, it was that thing about counseling, the support for the community. It shows they're thinking about the bigger picture.
It's not just the physical stuff, right?
Sure.
The emotional impact, the trauma, that can be just as bad, sometimes worse, even if you weren't directly affected. This guide gets that.
It's like they understand true preparedness. It's more than just having supplies or a plan. It's about that human connection, the whole community being ready to heal and rebuild together. So, listener name, as you go about your day, think about that. What can you do, not just for yourself, but to make your community stronger, more resilient, for whatever might